I cannot express enough gratitude to the students. You can't hear me? Can you hear me now? No? Okay, can you hear me now? Okay, so what I was saying when the mic was not working is that I cannot express enough gratitude to all of you students for remembering me, even though I left this university 3 years ago. But as Jaya mentioned, I have taught in 4 or 5 universities. But my best and most memorable experience will always be this university, Jawaharlal Nehru University. And even though this university is a shell of what I remember, I was a student here, and then I went out, taught elsewhere, then joined back in 2007. The students make this place. And I can see even today, from all of you sitting here, it's you who will make this place. And I'm so glad to see all of you organize a seminar like this, which is very important. And lastly, as Jaya said, that I'm not here, that was not the brief given to me. It's not about talking about textbooks, even though I was a part of Delhi SCRT textbooks, the history textbook, the ancient textbook, as well as the textbooks that were written in 2006. I was part of the class 11 textbook, one of the chapters. But I'm supposed to talk about archaeology, the history of archaeology in India. Now, clearly, it's a very, very vast canvas, but I'll talk about my experience as being a practicing archaeologist and where I see this discipline today in India and what needs to be done. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be exploring this morning come afternoon various intersecting issues related to debates on the ontology of archaeology, which is that how is this discipline seen? How is this discipline defined? And you will see that I'm going to draw a lot from ideas developed outside India, because in many ways the discipline has been stultified in our country, and there are various reasons for it. The first thing is that the discipline today, that is the discipline of archaeology, is viewed not so much within the frame of a long chronology, but more through a methodological lens of analyzing material culture of not only the deep but of the contemporary. And it's very important to note that. A forceful argument is being made that in the ultimate analysis, archaeology is really a discipline of things and places, disused or still in use. A more critical concern that I raise deals specifically with the situation in India and is linked to the continuing practice of appending archaeology to ancient Indian history and treating the former as a source for the latter. Such a conceptualization of the discipline has resulted in several deleterious consequences. Not enough attention has been paid to the distinctiveness of archaeological methods and the rigorous training that is required before undertaking any kind of archaeological research. Another fallout has been that much more archaeological research in India has been undertaken on the deep past as compared to later historical periods, such as the medieval. And a more serious concern, however, is the lack of archaeological studies of modern and contemporary times, despite the immense possibilities, which are now, I'm happy to note, are beginning. I am part of it, Jaya is part of it, and several of my students are also undertaking archaeologies of later periods. So we trace a little bit about the birth of the discipline. Archaeology, with its roots in antiquarianism, history, philology, ethnology, geology, and natural history, emerged in Europe in the mid-19th century. At that time, the practitioners of archaeology perceived the discipline as being particularly suited for studying the past before history, often seen as commencing from the moment that is history begins, when written records begin to be produced, or what came to be labeled as prehistory, which in turn was subdivided into several phases, periods, ages, based on different materials such as stone and metal, and technologies that were used for making tools. It was C.J. Thomson who initially formulated the three-age chronological division comprising the Stone Age, the Bronze Age, and the Iron Age. And subsequently, the Stone Age was divided into Old Stone Age or Paleolithic, Middle Stone Age, Mesolithic, New Stone Age, Neolithic. Now, this creation of a prehistory and history divide took place in the early 19th century and was integral to the task of establishing a modernist view of the past. This also involved putting in place a set of disciplinary practices that led to the making of archaeology in the 19th and early 20th century. An interrelated development was the rise of the museum, again in the 19th century. In fact, the institutionalization of archaeology first took place in museums. It was in the Danish National Museum that the three-age division of time, that is Stone Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age, was developed by C.J. Thomson to bring order to the collection of artifacts housed there. Moreover, and I quote Paul Lane, museum and archaeological practices also began to change the ontological status of things so that they now became meaningful for their ability to represent the different stages of human progress, from savagery to barbarism to civilization, rather than as memories of ancestry. Now, the difficulties that the concept of prehistory poses for archaeological researchers have emanated from the experience of North American archaeologists who, during their interactions with African colleagues and collaborators, found the concept to be inappropriate for representing African histories. There has also been a growing concern among them about the impact of prehistory on the identities of Native Americans, indigenous and native-born peoples in Asia, Africa, Australia, and the Americas. In fact, they see the term as outside their way of constructing history, as well as an explicit denial of their deeper identities. So it is now being argued that a departure from the prehistory trope frees professional archaeologists as well as indigenous and native-born peoples to make histories that are no longer denied or fit into frameworks that privilege either the absence or presence of literary representation. The application of an expression like prehistory can today prevent the attempts of many indigenous peoples in the Americas, in Africa, in Australia, Asia, to reclaim histories that have either been erased or denied. In many ways, this label signifies not only alterity, but also an absence of history and its making of identity. Moreover, given the long history of humans on Earth, and one not limited to the period that witnessed the generation of written documents, can there be a history, a time before, can there be a prehistory, a time before history, or should it be deep history? And attached to prehistory are also notions of primitiveness or technological backwardness. Therefore, in recognition of the inappropriateness of a term like prehistory, unfortunately still very much used in India, in 1998, the editorial board of the journal Australian Archeology recommended that its use be avoided. Another outcome of this divide between prehistory and history was the privileging of written accounts over material remains when dealing with the archaeological record of historical periods. This privileging of documentary sources remains a considerable tension in the disciplinary relationship between history and archaeology. An attempt is now being made to construct history and historical narratives that utilize oral testimonies and local or indigenous knowledge while incorporating archaeological data. In the case of South Asia, such an endeavor can be best exemplified in the work done in the Northeast by Tiatoshi Jamir. Through his work, it has been shown how ancestors of different local or descendant communities in the Naga Hills evoke cultural memories that serve as a link between the past and the present. Elsewhere in the world too, ancestors have been instrumental in keeping deep histories alive of sacred places. Deep time history is an open-ended concept which seeks to eliminate the factitious binary between prehistory and history. Deep time history has no beginning or ending points, with both shifting depending on when change occurs in the issues, in the structures, in the institutions, or processes that are being explained by archaeologists and historians. The concept of proto-history, in fact, when I was here in CHS, I had inherited a paper called Proto-History, which I had been taught when I was a student, and when I joined CHS, I did away with that paper, Proto-History. I believe it's been brought back and is being taught in CHS. So the concept of proto-history, however problematic, too indicates that the boundary between history and prehistory has long been fuzzy rather than sharp. Further, the issue of overlapping temporalities is evident across all chronological periods, both in archaeology as well as in history. Adherence to the various chronological periods tends to frequently fence off such linkages that may actually exist across them. Thus, we find that increasingly both historians and archaeologists prefer the concept of entangled temporalities. The scope of archaeological studies too has expanded far beyond deep time studies, with archaeologists now venturing into medieval past since the 1920s. Forays into these later periods were eventually recognized legitimized and encouraged the formation of different archaeological societies in Britain, such as the Society for Medieval Archaeology, established in 1957, for the study of the period from the 5th to the 16th century CE, and the Society for Post-Medieval Archaeology in 1967 for the promotion of historical archaeology, which extended from the 16th till 18th centuries and subsequently to the present times. Across the Atlantic in the United States, the Society for Historical Archaeology was set up in 1967 with the aim of studying material remains of past societies that also left behind documentary and oral histories. This subfield of archaeological studies saw the emergence of and the transformation of the modern world, that is after the 15th century. Now all these three societies also started bringing out journals right from the outset. So these were the journals titled Medieval Archaeology, Post-Medieval Archaeology, and Historical Archaeology. And just to illustrate how prolific research has been in the medieval and modern periods, we can track the growth of these disciplines, of these journals, over the last 60 years. Post-medieval archaeology began with a single issue in a year, but from 2003 expanded to 2 issues, and since 2014 it has increased to 3 issues. Historical archaeology began with 1 issue, but from 1981 till 1989 it became biannual, and since 1990 it brings out 4 issues in a year. There has been, in fact, such an exponential interest in historical archaeology that another journal called International Journal of Historical Archaeology began publishing 4 issues a year since it was initiated in 1997. And even Medieval Archaeology Journal has proliferated from 1 issue since 1957 to 2 issues from 2016 onwards. So you can see this is outside India. This is not in India. But before I get into the situation in India, let's try and understand what defines the discipline of archaeology. Now, in recent years, history of archaeology or historiography of archaeology has emerged as a distinct field of archaeological research. Although histories of archaeology have been written since the last 70 years, there seems to be much more of an interest, and they become much more prolific since the 1980s. In many ways, the collection of papers in the readers on histories of archaeology are illustrative of the changing concerns within this field. These interests include biographies of practitioners, both famous and less well known, histories of archaeological institutions, studies of the social, political, and cultural contexts of archaeological knowledge production, studies of the evolution of archaeology as a distinct discipline, and historiography. In the last 3 decades, there has been a growing engagement with the relationship between archaeology and nationalism, very much an issue in India. The role of women in the history of discipline, and this is important because there was a time when women were not allowed to do archaeology because they thought field work is too difficult for women. The creation of disciplinary institutions such as university departments, museums, journals, recruitment and training of archaeologists, and funding of major archaeological projects. For Murray and Evans, perhaps of even greater importance is an engagement with more fundamental questions concerning the identity of archaeology, particularly the distinctiveness with respect to cognate disciplines such as anthropology or history. The most compelling arguments for the distinctiveness of archaeology as a discipline center around its methods, with a focus on the analysis of materiality. What we are now witnessing is really a debate, therefore, on the ontology of archaeology itself. Increasingly, archaeologists are arguing that what has defined archaeology from the beginning has not been so much a long chronology, but a new method for understanding the past, the analysis of material culture. For Harrison and Schofield, concurring with many other archaeologists, argue that the word archaeology has become more methodological in its meaning than one that defines a particular period of interest. That's why someone like me can move across periods, starting from the ancient and coming to the contemporary. Although sound criticism has been raised against these probably too simplistic categorizations, the manner by which archaeology derives its primary data distinguishes it from both carefully controlled experiments of the natural sciences, the questionnaires and participant observation of the social sciences, and the text and archive-based humanities. Moreover, archaeology has now expanded far beyond anthropology and history, successfully forging links with diverse disciplines from the biological, physical, chemical sciences and the social sciences to the humanities. Archaeology can gain much from being defined not in relation to chronology, but in relation to materiality. And it is this premise that makes historical archaeology and the archaeology of the recent past feasible. Olson avers that archaeology is a discipline of things past and present, in use and abandoned. A question that is also being raised is whether archaeologists should restrict themselves to the abandoned, even if it is a very recent abandonment, while the idea that archaeology works with the present, in as much as the remains it studies are in the present, has been argued for over a century. After all, that's what archaeologists do. We look at past remains, but in the present. However, accepting that it can fully deal with the present too has not been an easy task, because it seemingly appears to go against what is perceived to be the essence of the discipline, which is that it deals with the deep past. But what is important for us to note is that the discipline of archaeology is being continually transformed and is no longer limited to merely recording objects, places, practices that are extinct or have fallen into ruins. In the last 2 decades, it has developed a series of tools alongside its more conventional ones for scrutinizing objects, places, practices within our own society, and I mean the present society, that are still in use. So let's move on to these new possibilities that are being developed. Now, Buckley and Lucas, way back in 2001, which is like 24 years ago, have mapped out a new set of possibilities for the discipline that have since enabled a completely different track for archaeology than the one that was conceived originally, that it was meant to only study the deep past. Since the last 2 decades, several archaeologists from different theoretical positions have been writing that archaeology can deal not just with the past, but also with the present. And in response to this emerging sub-discipline, that is contemporary archaeology, in 2013, Rodney Harrison founded a biannual journal called Journal of Contemporary Archaeology. There's also a group called CHAT, CHAT, Contemporary and Historical Archaeology in Theory, that was established in 2003, and this group holds annual conferences. Now, an often repeated question has been that since there are so many other disciplines that deal with the contemporary, why should archaeologists study the contemporary past? A persuasive contention made is that archaeology could foreground particularly those facets of contemporary life that are often pushed to the margins, being often overwritten by dominant narratives. Thus, there are certain themes that have been central to contemporary archaeology: production, consumption, remembering, forgetting, disappearance, disclosure, presence, absence, etc. A facet that has also been central to the discipline of archaeology has been the study of everyday life. This holds true for archaeology of the contemporary past as well. As a result of the silence of everyday life, experience of the majority becomes marginalized through an emphasis on elite groups who are seen to be those who produce culture. Thus, part of the rationale for a study of everyday life is to combat this process whereby the majority become marginalized. An initial interest of archaeologists venturing into contemporary archaeology was in the First and Second World Wars, followed by the Cold War, and eventually the focus shifted to contemporary times. Harrison and Schofield also explore ways in which archaeology as a form of documentation becomes a political and social intervention when its gaze is turned towards the contemporary past. This political dimension has in fact been seen as the defining attribute of archaeology of the contemporary past. Thus, research has focused on war, on concentration camps, refugees, protest, and so forth. As Harrison and Schofield argue, and I'm quoting them, an archaeology of the contemporary past has a significant role to play as a form of political comment. At the same time, there is also an expectation that the archaeology of the contemporary past can offer solutions to social problems based on the material record, for instance, on issues of managing waste or policies for addressing homelessness, etc. Now, we also need to look at archaeological practices. Therefore, we need to have ethnographies of archaeological, because we have to turn the gaze on our own practices. We have to have a critique. We have to have reflexivity. Some amount of work has been done in India, though very little. Now, at the core of archaeology lies field work and field practices that have been changing since the last 150 years. And we find that since the early 21st century, attempts are being continually made to not just interrogate the current field archaeological practices, but also study their genealogies. These studies have been deeply influenced by the post-processual approaches that have encouraged self-reflexivity and the embracing of ethnography. Such studies have not only raised questions about the relationship between archaeology and anthropology, but have also encouraged greater reflexivity in fieldwork methodologies. Turning a gaze upon ourselves as archaeologists can cause discomfort, yet it is necessary to explore the microprocesses of the production of archaeological knowledge. In India, however, there is a near absence of such studies, barring a recent ethnography of the quotidian practices of the Archaeological Survey of India. In terms of archaeological practices, Mortimer Wheeler, who was the Director General of the ASI between 1944 and 1948, all of you would know him, has had an enduring legacy within ASI. And I'm quoting Ashish Avikuntak, who has written this ethnography. The choice of Wheelerian archaeology was not because the ASI was caught in a time warp. Rather, Wheelerian archaeology was the preferred mode of the ASI, as it was an ideological apparatus that was not only efficacious in the manufacture, control, and regulation of facts about the past, but it also had a bureaucratic rationality designed to control and manage the people working at the site. Succinctly put, the ASI bureaucratic archaeology perpetuates the colonial epistemological project reinforced by an authoritarian bureaucratic regime in post-colonial ecology. Now, another important observation is that the ASI does not derive its authority as a knowledge production organization. Rather, it exerts its influence and power by virtue of it being a government bureaucracy. The structural hierarchies and the surveillance practices that were inbuilt in the archaeological practices of this colonial institution have continued almost unaltered in the post-colonial setting. It is the ethnographic method that enabled Avikuntak to document the day-to-day excavation practices of the ASI, which clearly revealed how these were conducted as standardized bureaucratic procedures. I'll briefly talk about medieval archaeology in South Asia, just so that you know the kind of work that is being done in medieval archaeology. From the 1970s, medieval archaeology gradually began to develop as a subfield in India. Both Mehta, R.N. Mehta and M.S. Mate, as field archaeologists, have delineated methodological frameworks, especially for medieval archaeology. Mate was initially trained in medieval architecture and painting and taught courses on art and architecture of early India at Deccan College in Pune. Eventually, his interest in the medieval led him towards a medieval archaeology project on Daulatabad in collaboration with T. E. Pathi, a medieval historian. The archaeological work at Champaner began on the insistence of S.C. Mishra, a medieval historian who was at the Department of History, MS University of Baroda, in 1967, but that project remained incomplete. Similarly, it was Nurul Hasan, a medieval historian, later the Education Minister of India, who requested R.C. Gaur to excavate at Fatehpur Sikri in collaboration with the ASI between 1977 and 1988. Gaur mentions that Hasan had wanted him to excavate at Fatehpur Sikri for answering two specific questions that concerned the boundary of the palace and the habitation area of the construction workers, although neither of these were resolved. Iqtidar Alam Khan and Rezavi, both trained in medieval historians at AMU, have also documented through photographs and plans and identified medieval buildings, indigo vats, and irrigational infrastructure with the help of texts, a methodology generally followed by architectural historians. What is absent in their work are systematic surveys, usually undertaken by field archaeologists, which may have helped us better understand the quotidian activities of the residents of Fatehpur Sikri and other places. Much more inspiring medieval archaeological studies encompassing varied aspects are those of the imperial capital of Vijayanagara between the 14th and 17th century and the hinterland or the metropolitan region around the city. There are other major studies that have been carried out in the last 2 decades from Eastern India, Sheena Panja, Western India, Nanji, and Central India, Kennett, Hawkes, etc. 2 recent publications, one was a special issue of Medieval History Journal and the other a co-edited volume in which I was one of the editors, have also interrogated and unsettled the medieval, providing new insights and ways of doing medieval archaeology in South Asia. What is striking is that most of the contributors in these two edited volumes are field archaeologists whose early archaeological forays began in the ancient period and subsequently they moved into the medieval. This is not surprising given that no archaeology courses are ever taught in the medieval streams of history departments. Hence, the journey of an archaeologist in India must necessarily begin from the ancient section. At the same time, such crossings are not easy and require a lot of work to familiarize oneself with the histories of the later periods, and the hardest is to learn languages at that late stage, the knowledge of which may be required to read pertinent inscriptions and texts. It is not as if there is no interest among medieval historians in medieval archaeology, for it was an invitation from the editorial collective of the Medieval History Journal, and more specifically Ranjita Datta, who's a medieval historian at CHS right now, that has resulted in the special double issue on the archaeologies of the medieval in South Asia, which was co-edited by Mudit Trivedi, Hemant Kadambi, and myself. The issue has been put together with the hope that more conversations take place between archaeologists and historians than has been the case so far in the past. And I'll briefly talk about an ongoing interdisciplinary project centered on Mandu in central India, which is investigating society-environment interactions in relation to water management, climatic variability, and the making of the built environment in both urban and rural contexts. The Mandu project has been designed to explore a range of questions. How did people live and transform the environment to adapt to monsoon rain variability in a semi-arid environment? What can the study of the long-term lives of water bodies, both natural and constructed, tell us about the vulnerability, adaptation, and resilience in the face of climatic disturbances? What was the impact of climatic anomalies and related environment disasters such as drought, floods, famines on society, and on the transformations of the cultural landscape that took place in late medieval times? How did society respond to hydroclimatic extremes? To investigate these, the project is relying on a variety of disciplines, data sets, and techniques by bringing together scholars from the humanities, social, as well as environmental sciences. The project is also tracing continuities and discontinuities in the historical landscape and waterscape, failures and successes in water management, and analyzing them in ways that can give insights into the nature of change, vulnerability, and adaptation. Thus, the value of undertaking long-durée, multidisciplinary projects in India cannot be overstated, as their potential is immense. Now, let's talk about the institutional locations for archaeology in India, which is also root cause for many of the problems that beset the discipline. The initial institutional location for archaeology in India was within the ASI. That's why many people think archaeology is ASI, ASI is archaeology. Established by the colonial government in 1861, and as mentioned earlier, given the unchanged archaeological practices since then, there is very little possibility for the growth or transformation of the discipline in this bureaucratic setting. What is, however, deeply worrying is that even though archaeology was introduced in Deccan College as early as 1939, and within many universities from the 1950s onwards, yet the discipline remains stultified in India, whether it is housed in a history or an anthropology department. While historians here tend to see it as a source for history, particularly for the ancient period, anthropology departments in India regarded as one of the three subfields. Generally, they have physical anthropology, which is now more often referred to as biological or medical anthropology, social anthropology, and archaeology. But in both cases, its ambit has remained limited to the ancient period. A perception that was developed for archaeology in 19th century Europe and transplanted to its colonies, including India. Archaeology as a distinct discipline is neither a part of school curricula, nor are there separate departments of archaeology at the undergrad or even graduate levels in any university, barring 3 in India. What is astonishing is that even in the case of 3 universities, that is University of Calcutta, where it was set up in 1960, University of Kerala in 1997, Cotton College State University 2017, the chronological breadth of the discipline remains largely confined to the ancient period. Now, while medieval archaeology in South Asia is slowly but steadily growing, it is historical archaeology or archaeology of the modern world and contemporary archaeology where we draw a near blank. Hauser, Selvakumar, Riggs, Wilson are now doing some work. I'll talk a little bit about it. Brian Wilson, in his PhD in 2015, has explored the production of urban landscapes, human-environment interaction, and ruination in Goa, in Vella, Goa, during the Portuguese colonial occupation. Hauser and Selvakumar in 2021 published, and it's still ongoing work, are documenting changes in the patterns and organizations of settlements as well as material assemblages between the 12th and the 19th centuries at the Danish colonial enclave Trankebar or Tharangabadi and 23 associated villages and hamlets. This study involves, so I'll tell you about the method they are using. This study involves a systematic pedestrian survey in conjunction with textual, epigraphic, and cartographic data. The aim of the project is to understand changes and continuities between 2 specific settlement types, the gardens and plantations, with the former emerging between the 6th and the 13th century and the latter in the 17th and 18th centuries CE. Apart from a larger concern of decentering the role of the Atlantic world in the establishment of commercial agriculture during the early modern period, it is also demonstrating the importance of looking at the longer histories of a micro-region. With most histories of Tranquebar beginning in 1620 CE, this historical archaeology project has the advantage of uncovering the deeper paths of commercial agriculture in this region, one that predates the early modern period. And Erin Riggs in 2020 in her PhD looked at refugee resettlement in Delhi following the 1947 partition of India and Pakistan through the lens of contemporary archaeology, and is a study of material remains within homes that are still in use. Her study is based on maps, ethnographies, images of home spaces, and has produced an urban history of post-partition Delhi based on the lived experience of these refugee population. I am also now part of a team working on a contemporary archaeology project based on a comparative study of the Union Carbide Corporation, which was located in Bhopal, India, and Danbury, Connecticut. Now, just a little dip into the past. In 2019, when I was here at CHS, I wanted to devise a graduate level course, MA course, on historical archaeology at CHS. And I realized that it was simply impossible to limit the spatial frame to South Asia alone because so little work has been done in South Asia. And therefore, I would have to include global perspectives. So then I came up with 6 themes that would form the core of this course: doing historical archaeology, architecture, gender identity and power, urban historical archaeology, historical archaeology of empires, historical archaeology and colonialism, and colonial plantation spaces. Now, doing historical archaeology would consider key methods, theories, definitions, concepts, as well as the history of the field of historical archaeology. And the section on architecture, gender, identity, and power was going to explore ways through which architecture and artifacts can reveal aspects of power and gender relations, as well as differing identities. Urban historical archaeology would look at different traditions of urban archaeology with a particular focus on historiography as well as practices. And historical archaeology of empires would discuss sources, approaches, definitions, materiality of imperial sovereignty, integration, coercion, resistance, imperial ideologies, and the afterlives of empires. Archaeology as a discipline is particularly suited for long-term understanding of the varied forms of colonialism, beginning with the Uruk expansion in early Mesopotamia through the Roman and Aztec empires, followed by colonies of the modern European states. And colonial plantation spaces in the modern period have been archaeologically studied to construct an alternative narrative, one that is different from the conventional one about those who were enslaved. A central concern in this course has been the definition of historical archaeology. In other words, is historical archaeology an archaeology of the historical period, or is historical archaeology defined by its own theoretical and methodological approaches? Yet, and this is the sad part, I very quickly realized that even though this course dealt with the modern world, because it is an archaeology course, it could only be offered within the ancient stream. Ultimately, I saw little point in teaching this course, as the identification of archaeology with the deep past is so deeply etched that it becomes near impossible to attract students from sections other than the ancient. In South Asia, traditionally, historical archaeology has been viewed in a period-specific way, that it is defined as the study of that past of the archaeological record for which textual or documentary data is available. And we have two books, both titled Historical Archaeology of India. The first one is almost entirely on the early historic period, which is the period between 5th century BCE and 5th century CE, and there's looking at the correlation or lack of it between early historic texts and archaeological data. The second book, which is by Dhawlikar, in its subtitle mentions 1000 BC to 1800 AD, but the focus is entirely on the early historic period, that is the period between 600 BC to 300 AD. Now we find, in contrast, in the case of North America, Europe and Australia, the term historical archaeology is largely associated with the European colonial expansion in the last 500 years. There are, however, critiques of this understanding of historical archaeology being confined to the last 500 years from archaeologists in South America and Africa. And more recently, we are finding that the accepted understanding of historical archaeology as a subfield that studies the modern world has now been reviewed, and we are mapping new ways in defining historical archaeology. And this was done through two panels that were organized in 2021, where many of us got together and discussed how we should define historical archaeology, which makes sense in the global context, and not just look at it from the Western perspective or the Eurocentric or North Atlantic perspective. And this conversation that went on for 2-3 years has finally resulted in a co-edited volume, which I'm one of the editors along with Riggs, on historical archaeology in South Asia, which will be a very good reader for those who are interested in India, and it will be coming out next year. So to conclude, I'll just say 2-3 points. Archaeology is really located at the cusp of the arts and sciences. It's a field-based discipline. It has its own methods and theories that are different from historical and anthropological. Higher education in India at the undergrad level is trying or should try to move towards an interdisciplinary structure that is more broad-based. and at the same time provide disciplinary depth. Archaeology is well suited for this interdisciplinary space. This discipline can discern the quotidian lives of ordinary people in the past as well as in the present. This is possible through the material traces of people who were and continue to be at the margins of relatively more elite sections of societies and are unlikely to leave or be documented through written records. Globally, the discipline has transformed itself, taking huge strides in moving towards the late historical and contemporary periods. Moreover, through both research and teaching, archaeologists have begun to address many pressing contemporary problems and issues, making the discipline far more relevant. As is the case elsewhere, in India too, the temporal focus of archaeology must shift from the traditional foci of the most ancient past to later historical and contemporary periods. This more expansive temporal frame will enable the discipline to make stronger connections with contemporary issues such as climate change, water management, waste management, displacement, migration, abandonment of rural landscapes, and the concomitant effects on changing urbanscapes, inequality, and sustainability. Thank you.